In the Egyptian delta, at the head of which the river Nile divides, there is a certain district which is called the district of Sais, and the great city of the district is also called Sais. To this city came Solon, and was received there with great honor. He asked the priests who were most skillful in such matters, about antiquity. One of the priests, who was of a very great age, said, "O Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you." Solon in return asked him what he meant. "I mean to say," he replied, "that in mind you are all young, there is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you why. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes, the greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story, which even you have preserved, that once upon a time Pethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. You remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones."
Probably familiar with the story of the flood from the Bible, featuring Noah and the ark, but it turns out that a lot of cultures have flood myths. One explanation for this is the belief that myths are rooted in history. Flood myths may also reflect a common theme, the idea that creation's source is primordial waters. If water can bring life, it stands to reason it can also bring death. You can see the symbolism in various purification rituals like baptisms or prenuptial cleansings. They serve as tiny reenactments of floods where an old life is destroyed and a new life begins. Let's begin in ancient Mesopotamia with one of our favorite mythical sources, the Epic of Gilgamesh. At the beginning of this particular story, the hero Utnapishtim is talking to Gilgamesh about living in the city of Shuruppak on the banks of the Euphrates. He explains that a group of gods, Anu, Enlil, Ninurta, Ennugi, and Ea, put their divine heads together and decided to flood the place. Luckily for Utnapishtim, Ea has second thoughts and sneaks over to spill the beans. Ea secretly tells Utnapishtim what's going down and orders him to leave his home, all his possessions, and to build a boat which will carry the seed of all living things. When the hour of destruction arrives, the gods send down a terrifying storm, so terrifying that even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. And when they see what they've done to their creation, the gods, humbled, sat there weeping. The storm rages for 7 days before eventually blowing itself out. Utnapishtim looks out of a porthole and sees that all of mankind has been destroyed. His boat comes aground on Mount Nemush, and Utnapishtim sends out birds to search for dry land. This all probably sounds familiar to those of you who know the flood story from the Bible. Somewhere in between the inscrutable Babylonian flood and the sin-cleansing biblical flood is the Zoroastrian flood. This is a myth that comes to us from ancient Iran. It also features a lone survivor named Yima, who gathers 2 of each species to repopulate the earth. But rather than building a boat, Yima gathers the animals in his mountain castle, which is high enough to survive the rising floodwaters. The creator god, Ahura Mazda, decides that the earth needs a new beginning, not because of sin, but because it's overwhelmed by the constant multiplication of its immortal being. In yet another flood myth, this one from Ovid's Metamorphosis, Jupiter decides to destroy mortals for their sinfulness. So Jupiter gets together with Neptune, who pumps up the rivers and whips up some high winds and flood. There's no chosen survivors for Jupiter. He's trying to just wipe the slate clean. But luckily for humanity, 2 people, Deucalion and Pyrrha, are fortunate enough to survive. And so, life carries on. There's enough similarity in these myths to suggest that they may have influenced one another.
In a remote area of northwest Greenland, an international team of scientists has made a stunning discovery. Buried beneath nearly a kilometer of ice. It's an impact crater. 300 meters deep. 31 kilometers wide. Much bigger than Washington, D.C., even bigger than Paris, and it's probably one of the youngest large impact craters on Earth. The relentless spread of the Greenland ice sheet has covered the crater, obscuring it from view for thousands of years. Radar waves can travel through the ice, measuring its thickness and internal structure. Studying data from this airborne survey, the scientists confirmed the telltale bowl shape and central peaks beneath Hiawatha Glacier. They also found that the oldest ice in this crater was actually fairly young by Greenland standards and had experienced a great disturbance in its flow toward the end of the last ice age. Models suggest the asteroid was more than a kilometer wide. The Hiawatha crater is one of the 25 largest known impact craters on Earth, and the first found under any of our planet's ice sheets. Crucially, the Hiawatha impact crater still looks like an impact crater, even though it's covered by ice and seems to be rapidly eroding. The data as a whole suggests that the crater is quite young, geologically speaking. But we don't yet know exactly when an asteroid sped toward Earth, through the atmosphere, and into the planet's crust in northwest Greenland. The impact could have also occurred when ice already covered Greenland, and it would have instantly vaporized billions of tons of ice and rerouted the flow of ice and water into the ocean. Whenever the impact happened, life on Earth at the time would have been profoundly affected.
There's now growing recognition that an extinction-level global cataclysm unfolded very recently. The last glacial maximum, if you look at the chart, was reached 21,000 years ago. After that, temperatures began to warm. But then suddenly, with ice sheets still 2 kilometers deep on top of North America and Northern Europe, there was a striking and dramatic plunge in temperatures, a short, sharp deep freeze that lasted from roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. This period of extreme and anomalous cold is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas. The mystery is what caused it. It turns out, 12,800 years ago, multiple fragments of a giant disintegrating comet hit the Earth, with the epicenter of the cataclysm on the North American ice cap. Why did the impacts 12,800 years ago cause the worldwide plunge in temperatures witnessed at the beginning of the Younger Dryas? The best explanation is that floods of icy meltwater released by the heat and kinetic energy of the impacts flowed off the North American ice cap and into the Atlantic Ocean, where they interrupted the Gulf Stream, a key element of the central heating system of our planet, hence the sudden and dramatic cooling. Why did the Younger Dryas end equally suddenly 11,600 years ago with a dramatic rise in temperatures? The science on what caused the end of the Younger Dryas is not as complete as the science on the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Whatever the agency, however, the facts on the ground are not in dispute. The Younger Dryas did end abruptly 11,600 years ago. Global temperatures soared, and the remnant ice caps very rapidly collapsed into the sea, causing a dramatic pulse of sea level rise, nominated by geologists as Meltwater Pulse 1b. Is it a coincidence that 11,600 years ago, the date of Meltwater Pulse 1b is also the date that Plato gives for the destruction and submergence of Atlantis? Let's double-check Plato's date. The story he tells us was passed down to him through his family line, from his ancestor, the famous Greek lawmaker Solon, who visited Egypt around 600 BC, and there claimed to have been told the story of Atlantis by priests in the temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta. Solon asked the priests when the disaster occurred, and they replied matter-of-factly 9,000 years ago. Remember that this was in 600 BC, and of course 9,000 years ago in 600 BC is 9,600 BC in our calendar, in other words 11,600 years ago, the precise date that modern geological science puts on Meltwater Pulse 1b and a sudden global rise in sea level. If Plato made the whole thing up, as historians tell us, then he was astonishingly on the money with 21st century science linking a global flood cataclysm to the date of 11,600 years ago. And something else, the same precise date is now being cited by archaeologists as a highly significant one, the date at which the invention of both megalithic architecture and agriculture occurred apparently for the first time in the world. The place where this happened was Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
Through history, comets have been seen as bad omens. People believed a comet heralded the assassination of Julius Caesar, and another foretold the Black Death in medieval England.
Currently, there's over 170 known impacts that have been absolutely validated by physical methods. Of those impacts that have been documented, there are none in the ocean. And yet the oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's landmass. So we are missing a large percentage of recent impacts because they occurred in the ocean.
According to Doctors Abbott and Massey, one of those missing impacts may have happened 4,800 years ago. They believe that its catastrophic effects could have inspired the story of the Great Flood, found in the Bible and other accounts. Throughout the ancient world, different cultures, from Europe and Asia to the Americas, had legends of a great flood.
Because we only have truly one universal myth, that's the myth of the Great Flood, it was my hypothesis that perhaps it was evidence of a globally catastrophic event.
According to Dr. Massey, this globally catastrophic event may have been the impact of a comet crashing into Earth. Many of the legends describe supernatural creatures or fiery objects appearing in the sky around the time of the flood.
Sometimes these things are described exactly like comets, as flames in the sky. But at least 33 of these myths talked about creatures that were suggestive of a comet.
Dr. Massey sees further evidence of widespread disaster in a series of global changes that occurred 4,800 years ago. At that time, advanced societies were already developing in many parts of the world.
This was already the time of the first dynasty of pharaohs living in Egypt, very advanced civilization.
Then, around the year 2800 BC, there was a series of sudden climate and social changes across the globe.
All of a sudden, we get a cooler environment. Areas that had before been forest, all of a sudden they're savannas, they're open grassland.
The relationship between the oceans and the atmosphere also changed.
The well-known El Nino Southern Oscillation is really a driver for climate on the Earth, undergoes a profound change itself about 4,800 years ago in terms of its periodicity, in terms of its intensity.
Also during this time, there were a number of human migrations.
Populations are moving around. Language dispersals, for example, we get Austronesians moving out of Taiwan and mainland China down to Southeast Asia. We get Indo-Aryans moving out of northern India into Eastern and Central Europe.
Dr. Massey suggests that all these social upheavals and climatic changes can be traced to a great flood that he believes was caused by a comet strike.
We're seeing multiple different things that suggest to us we're looking at a single event at 4,800 years ago as a causal explanation for all of these myths, and it seems to be an oceanic comet impact.
In the course of his research, Dr. Massey found that the geographical distribution of certain mythical motifs were centered on a specific location.
I analyzed 175 Great Flood myths worldwide. And if you map these out, the distribution of these myths, they actually sort of make a broad circle, approximately about 9,000 kilometers away from a central part in the Indian Ocean. And it would appear that this is telling us that there was a comet impact at that location. looking at the environmental information contained in those myths, such things as the amount of rainfall, the presence of hurricane-force winds, tsunamis. All of these myths together formed a logical picture of something happening at a single point in time.
It is difficult to assign an exact date to the Great Flood, but Dr. Massey suggests that the legends themselves may point science in the right direction.
I was able to hypothesize a precise date for this event by looking at what was in the myths, talking about conjunctions of planets in certain constellations, lunar eclipses, solar eclipse, and conjunction of 4 or 5 naked eye visible planets at a single point in time is a very rare event. And using the software astronomy programs, I was able to come up with a series of events that occurred in 2807 BC.
Dr. Massey proposes that a massive comet, perhaps 3 miles wide, may have crashed into the Indian Ocean 930 miles southeast of Madagascar. The comet would have hit the waves at over 100,000 miles per hour, with over 30 million megatons of energy, generating a mega tsunami that would have devastated coastal lands and human settlements on 4 continents. Torrential rains, created by the vast injection of seawater and impact debris into the upper atmosphere, would have flooded land across the world. Small aerosol impact particles would have been ejected into the stratosphere, blocking the sun's radiation and generating cooler temperatures. But mythological accounts are not proof.
Mythology by itself cannot really prove anything when it comes to looking at natural events. We need physical evidence itself.
Scientists are searching for that physical evidence in the Indian Ocean. There, proof of a colossal comet strike may lie hidden in rocks smaller than a human hair. So, how do we begin looking for evidence of a massive comet impact in the oceans? Scientists are tackling the search on many fronts. Evaluating satellite images to identify crater structures all over the world and to locate soil deposits left on the coasts by megatsunamis. Studying computer models to predict the possible effects of oceanic impacts. And analyzing seafloor and coastal sediment samples under electron microscopes. Dr. Abbott began her search for evidence of this catastrophic comet impact in the Indian Ocean.
One reason why I focused on the Indian Ocean was because of Bruce Mass's work, where he's compiled oral histories, and what he determined was that the center of this large deluge event was in the Indian Ocean.
The first physical evidence of this alleged crater was found not in the ocean itself, but on the beaches of Australia and Madagascar. Massive sedimentary deposits called chevrons, some of them the size of Manhattan.
The chevron dune is almost like swash on a beach. You know, you get a wave coming in and it leaves an outline. They're roughly V-shaped. But if you take the V-shaped dune coming in, its trend points back towards the source.
That source could have been a massive impact in the Indian Ocean.
When a big impactor comes in and hits the ocean floor, it doesn't make just a crater in the sea floor, it also makes a crater, an even wider crater in the water. And then what happens is that this water has to fill in the hole and it crashes back in and then it oscillates back and forth several times.
Such an impact would have created colossal waves called mega tsunamis.
So if we're talking about a diameter of 3 miles for the impactor, typically a large impactor coming in like that could produce a wave that was initially about 3 miles high.
By the time they reached the coast of Madagascar, the waves would still have been colossal, creating the chevrons by depositing large amounts of coastal sediment and impact debris.
In the Madagascar chevrons, we found a number of features that we think are materials that are derived from an oceanic impact.
such as these deep cold water microfossils called foraminifera.
This is a picture of one of these bottom-living foraminifera. And note that all the magnesium, which is in blue, is mostly just right on the outside of the chambers. And we think that this may be due to boiling of seawater in the chambers right after the impact.
But where in the Indian Ocean is the impact crater itself? Satellite imagery may provide the answer. The surface of the sea roughly follows the profile of the sea floor. Underwater seamounts and depressions affect the gravitational pull of Earth on the ocean surface. So we can find holes in the sea floor by measuring the profile of the sea surface with satellites.
I took the Chevron dunes and I used their trends to look for possible craters. The direction that the Chevron dunes point converges very closely on a location where you have a hole in the ocean floor, a nice round hole.
This hole is 930 miles southeast of Madagascar, an 18-mile wide structure, 13,000 feet underwater, known as Burkle Crater. Still, Dr. Abbott needs more evidence to prove that Burkle Crater was created by a comet impact.
What we hope to learn is what's the source of the impact that produced Burkle Crater. We really don't know enough about comets and asteroids to be sure right now we can tell.